Hello everyone, and welcome to the Beginner's Guide to Genshin Impact. My name is Azuark, and I have claimed in previous videos that reactions are the heart of Genshin's gameplay, but I basically haven't talked about them at all, so it's high time we do that. We're going to start with the three easiest elements to talk about: Pyro, Cryo, and Hydro. To begin with though, we need to address how reactions work in general. When you hit an enemy with a physical attack, nothing special happens. They take damage. That's it. However, if you land an elemental attack from your character's skill or burst, or just normal attacks from Catalyst users, you inflict a status effect on the enemy. If that enemy already has a different elemental status, this will result in a reaction occurring. Well, usually. With 7 elements in the game, there are 21 ways to pair 2 elements, and 17 of them produce a reaction. Inflicting this status effect is usually referred to by players as applying an element or simply putting that element on the enemy. When the second element produces the reaction, we say that it triggers the reaction. The status effect itself is often called an aura. Auras themselves do nothing, other than that Cryo reduces movement and attack speed. They also only last a few seconds before they run out. Each time you trigger a reaction, it uses up a certain amount of this timer, which, in most cases, will remove it completely. Sometimes the old element will remain with a much shorter timer, sometimes the new element will take over for a brief duration, but usually there will simply be nothing left. I'm not going to explain the exact mechanics of this, but theory crafters have studied this extensively and created a concept known as elemental gauge theory that describes this phenomenon if you really want to know what's going on under the hood. Having said all that, we have 3 reactions we're going to talk today about, starting with Melt. Melt is the reaction formed by combining Pyro and Cryo. If you hit an enemy with Cryo, and then follow that up with Pyro, you get bonus damage. As an amplifying reaction, Melt will look at however much damage your Pyro attack would do, and it doubles it. It just straight up doubles it, that's what it does. So if you have a main damage dealer who deals Pyro, like Diluc, and you use a Cryo character first, like his brother Kaya, Diluc's Pyro attacks will hit noticeably harder. Or rather, attack. Singular. The problem with this scenario is that after Diluc melts the Cryo off the enemy, it's gone. So unless you have a way of putting Cryo back, he's only going to be benefiting from 1 hit of damage. Sometimes that's fine, and you just want your first hit to be extra strong, but it's far more likely you want to have a continued onslaught. Searing onslaught, if you will. Diluc's elemental skill can be used 3 times in a row, and only melting the first hit is less than ideal. Curiously, if we were to swap this around and trigger Melt with Cryo, rather than a 100% bonus to the damage, it's only 50. Players refer to the Cryo and then Pyro version as Forward Melt, and this Pyro and then Cryo edition as Reverse Melt. And although that sounds like that means it's weaker, this is actually usually preferable because it often leaves the first element behind to trigger more reactions. Maybe someday we'll do a deeper dive to explain all that, but right now the details aren't super important. All you need to know is that in either direction, Melt makes an attack deal more damage. Reaction number 2 is Vaporize, triggered by combining Pyro and Hydro, and it works exactly the same way as Melt, except the 50 versus 100% is reversed as it relates to Pyro. So once again, if you create a Vaporize reaction, big damage number go brr. To illustrate this, let's look at one of the most Vaporize-oriented characters in the game, Hu Tao. I'm going to hop onto my main account for a second, because that's where I have Hu Tao, and try to make use of what little I've learned about video editing from 15 previous videos. First, let's take a look at the numbers Hu Tao deals by herself. Look at those red numbers. And because this is an endgame account, of course those numbers are bigger than what you're seeing in-game. But let's look at what happens when we add Cryo. When we produce a Melt reaction, the initial hit Hu Tao deals is substantially larger. However, you might notice that this is basically the only change, because after that first reaction eats the Cryo aura, there's nothing to produce a reaction with later. There's 2 ways we can fix that. One is to find a character who can keep adding that element when they're not on field, and the other is to switch to Vaporize. We're going to do both. With Xingqiu's Rain Swords adding extra Hydro damage between each hit, you're seeing some blue numbers too, but focus on the reaction numbers. Numbers, plural. There's lots of them. Even after hitting the enemy with Pyro to trigger a Vaporize reaction, there's still Hydro left behind for the next attack, and Hu Tao hits very quickly, so we have lots of Vaporizes happening. Ultimately, this is more because of Xingqiu's ability to keep adding more Hydro than it is to the difference between the two reactions, but because we have several Hydro characters who can apply their element very rapidly, much more so than we have for Cryo, Hu Tao almost exclusively uses Vaporize when we have a choice, even though we're using a reverse Vaporize that deals less bonus damage versus a forward Melt which has twice the effect. Anyway, enough about that. We have one more reaction to discuss.
Freeze!
We're limiting ourselves to just 3 elements today, but the combination that doesn't include Pyro is Freeze. Melt and Vaporize are the only reactions that even slightly care about the order, so we're happy just throwing Hydro and Cryo at an enemy however we can. You'll notice very quickly that Freeze is nothing like Melt and Vape. It doesn't do any damage. Instead, it just paralyzes the enemy for a couple seconds. The duration of the freeze effect is very short, but there's nothing that says we can't just refreeze them. This is often the plan of attack for teams that are dedicated to working with freeze. They can't rely on any bonus damage, but they can rely on the enemy never being a threat of fighting back. Sometimes these teams don't even run a healer. The character who is best known as being the Queen of Freeze is Ayaka, but I don't own her, so we'll stick to looking at other characters. As you can see, I can sometimes keep an enemy locked down for as long as it takes to kill them, but there's a few important things to note. First, this is a team dedicated to freeze. It only has Cryo and Hydro characters. When you're starting off, I don't recommend only using 2 elements unless you have an absolutely amazing setup. Second, not every enemy can be frozen. If you try to freeze a boss, you're going to be in for a bad time. And third, we have an extra bonus reaction to talk about today. Shatter. Certain attacks in the game are considered heavy. These are the same attacks that do heavy damage to ore, and right now I'm specifically interested in claymores. If you attack a frozen enemy with a claymore, they will shatter. It deals extra damage, but not so much that shatter is a reaction we want to build a team around. Meanwhile, it ends the freeze effect, and the enemy can now attack back. For this reason, most players consider shatter an active nuisance, because otherwise it would allow a character like Eula to attack her foes unimpeded. And that concludes our discussion of specific reactions, since we're out of ways to combine Pyro, Cryo, and Hydro. However, there's one more mechanic I'd like to bring up today, because it's kinda important. Internal cooldown, or ICD, is a limiting factor that keeps reactions from being spammed too quickly. Let's look at what happens if Diluc attacks with his triple elemental skill combo. Note that the second attack doesn't react. Instead, the game makes him wait 2.5 seconds. And since his third attack is sufficiently later, it does get a reaction, but we can often lose reactions because of this. Characters who attack especially quickly can overcome the 2.5 seconds by applying their element faster, and it will simply trigger on every third hit instead. Or at least that's the norm. There are a number of abilities that have their own special ICD, or none at all. For example, Hu Tao's regular attacks have the regular cooldown, but her charge attacks don't have one at all, which is why I was able to create so many reactions earlier. Jiang Ling's Pyronado is another ability that very famously avoids internal cooldown. Fully understanding internal cooldown isn't important. All you need to know is that if you try to do a bunch of reactions in a row, you might not get all of them. Tomorrow we're going to add Electro into the mix, which gives us 3 new reactions to talk about, so thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.